Hey folks, this week on True Crime Tuesday, we're going to be looking at three cases that are dominating national headlines, each different in details, but united by one theme: human behavior under stress and the tragic consequences that follow. First, we're going to examine the death of Michael Duarte, the popular food influencer who's known as FoodWithBearHands. He was shot and killed by a Medina County Sheriff's deputy in Texas. Then we're going to move to Las Vegas, where I am now, where an 11-year-old boy was shot and killed during a road rage dispute. It's a heartbreaking reminder that everyday irritations can escalate into deadly violence when ego, stress, weapons get mixed. And finally, we're going to revisit one of the coldest, darkest cases in America, which happened over the U.S. holiday in 2010. And with Thanksgiving right around the corner, this one's important. The disappearance, now murder case of three little boys was memorialized as the Skelton Brothers. And after 15 long years, their father has been charged with their murders. This episode is a reminder of how fragile safety can be and how quickly behavior can escalate into crime, and how important it is to understand the warning signs long before the tragedies unfold. Well, hey folks, I'm Mike King and welcome to Profiling Evil. Thanks for joining us on this True Crime Tuesday. I hope you'll take a minute, hit that like and subscribe button as we get started on our journey today. It's going to transition through three different cases that on the surface look very different. But when you peel back the layers, they all seem to speak to the same core themes: human behavior under stress. Moments where things spiral out of control and the long grinding road toward justice is the final outcome. This week, I'm in Las Vegas speaking at a conference on reducing personal risk. And as I review these three cases, I can't help but see them as one that's connected through conversation. So we're going to start in Texas with the shooting death of food influencer Michael Duarte, the man that millions of people knew as FoodWithBearHands. Heck, I watched this guy. I loved getting some tips from him on barbecuing. From there, we're going to move over. We'll stay on topic of impulsive, lethal decision making, but we're going to move over to a road rage incident right here in Las Vegas of an 11-year-old boy on a roadway. Again, just a few miles from where I sit right now. And then we're going to shift into a very different kind of pain. And we're going to look at different kinds of timelines as we look back 15 years in the making to Michigan and the Skelton Brothers, three young boys who vanished over Thanksgiving. Their father has now been charged with their murders. So let's start with Michael Duarte, because his death is stirring up a lot of conflicting emotions. You see, on the one hand, you've got a guy who rebuilt his life in the public eye. He was the barbecue backyard guy with an infectious laugh. He cooked with his daughter. He let followers into his world in a way that kind of felt personal and genuine. He shared that he'd been going through and had gone through major mental health crises in his life, and that he'd been through rehab, and that he'd found a new pathway. People watched that transformation, and in a way, they invested in it and in him. And to them, he wasn't just a creator on screen. He was somebody that they were rooting for. And then the headlines broke that Duarte had been shot and killed by a sheriff's deputy in Castroville, Texas. Overnight, the same guy that people were used to watching throw meat on a smoker in his backyard was being described in law enforcement reports as armed, erratic, a subject who was threatening people and first responders with a knife. For a lot of folks, the story simply didn't compute. It didn't line up with the version of Duarte that they thought they knew, especially that idea of the public version. Well, that tension between the public image And the private struggles that were going on is where this conversation is going to start, because I want to walk through what's being reported, what's been reported. On November 8th, a 911 call came into the Castroville 911 Center, a rural community just outside of San Antonio, Texas. Now, fire and EMS responded to the disturbance, which involved a man with a knife who was reportedly behaving erratically and making threats. When the emergency medical people arrived, they were dealt with volatility. So they decided the situation was unsafe and that they needed to call for law enforcement. And that tells you that the temperature of this thing was already incredibly high before that first deputy ever arrived. The medical people said way too much going on here. Now, according to the Medina County Sheriff's Office, when the deputy arrived, Duarte, armed with a knife, was confronted by the deputy who repeatedly gave commands to drop the weapon. Now, the report says that Duarte refused and reportedly yelled something close to, quote, "I'm going to kill you." And then he charged at the deputy. Well, within seconds, the deputy fired. EMS was already on scene, thankfully. They treated Duarte immediately and transported him over to the San Antonio hospitals, where he eventually died. Now, that's the neat, polished version that you get in short press statements. And as somebody who's worked these kinds of scenes before, I can tell you that the real life experience is anything but neat. I mean, there's yelling, there's confusion, there's adrenaline pumping, divided attention. You got EMS who are already feeling endangered. Now you have a deputy on the scene who's trying to assess a rapidly moving threat. You've got a guy who's in crises, whose behavior is detached from the calm persona that his followers are used to seeing online. Everyone in that moment is reacting to something that's really intense and, quite frankly, terrifying. Now, here's the piece all of us are waiting on. It's the body cam footage. And that video is going to be the most critical provider of information. I mean, really, it's going to show us how much distance was between Duarte and the deputy. How quickly did Duarte move toward the deputy? Were there obstacles or avenues where the deputy could have retreated? And whether there was time for non-lethal options. These use of force investigations live and die on detail. And this case now is in the hands of the Texas Rangers, who are going to dig into it. They're going to look at the body cam, the 911, audio, witness testimonies, physical evidence, toxicology. They're going to look at the deputy's history and training. And then we'll have a fuller picture of what happened in those microseconds leading up to his death. You know, we've got to acknowledge something that often gets lost in the noise too. Duarte apparently had a documented history of mental health struggles. He talked publicly about depression and rehab, especially during the pandemic, and people really respected him for being more than honest. But a past crisis doesn't just vanish because somebody becomes successful. There may be additional stressors, chemicals, fatigue, medication, emotional triggers. All of these things can lead to what clinicians call acute psychiatric crises. And those crises don't show up politely. I mean, they come in hot and they come in without a lot of warning. And for those EMS workers, facing a subject who is highly agitated, armed with a knife, and moving unpredictably is dangerous, and it's a nightmare. For a trained law enforcement officer, a charging suspect with an edged weapon is a textbook example of a lethal threat. Now, we know from years of training videos that a person with a knife can close that 15 to 20 foot gap faster than most officers can even respond to the threat, quicker than they can draw their weapon and effectively fire. Now, that doesn't make it any less heartbreaking when force is used. And it doesn't make it any easier for a family that just lost a husband and a father. But it does frame how agencies are trained to interpret that scenario. And we often talk about, hey, it was only a knife and the officer had a gun. Well, let me show you what. In a minute, I'm going to tell you how dangerous that is. You know, I think it's also interesting they've established a GoFundMe page and a debate's in place there, Because while Duarte's wife is scrambling to bring his body home and to begin the funeral planning, a crowdfunding campaign appears to be asking for help. And for a lot of people, that sparked a lot of confusion, because the question becomes, how does a guy with millions of followers and a successful brand end up needing financial help to cover funeral costs? But that's one of the great myths of the internet, I think. Follower count doesn't necessarily equal cash in the bank. Many creators pour money back into the equipment, travel, editing, inventory, collaboration, taxes. Their income can fluctuate wildly from month to month based on how their videos are doing. And few have benefits like an employer-sponsored life insurance program or health benefits. So when sudden death happens, sometimes these families are hit with immediate expenses that they're simply not prepared for. And you add to the cost transporting these remains back across state lines to his home, this thing becomes even more overwhelming. But it doesn't change the fact you got to question whether a GoFundMe means something sinister is happening or not. And I don't think it does. It usually means a family was blindsided. It usually means a young widow is staring at bills while trying to help a child understand that dad isn't coming home. And in this case, Duarte's wife has posted about leaning on faith, leaning on the community, trying to preserve his legacy. I mean, you can hear the shock and brokenness in her words. But the question becomes, how does that leave us in the decision of whether to donate or not? So I want you just to face the facts that there is this GoFundMe out there, and you make the decision. Make it with some education behind you of whether that's necessary or not. Now, in looking at some online reports, it shows that he's making $200,000 to $300,000 a year. Again, I wonder how accurate that is. But again, make the decision. They're asking for $100,000. Some people say that this thing has already gone into the tens of thousands, and it's up to you to decide if you're going to donate to this cause or not. Doesn't change the tragedy, and it doesn't change how sad this entire story is. So that leaves me asking, where does it leave us? I mean, right now it leaves us in a familiar true crime tension zone. On the one side, you've got those who look at the facts that the sheriff's office has put out and say, hey, the deputy had no choice. I kind of lean that way. On the other side, you got people insisting that there had to have been another way to solve this problem. Some kind of a non-lethal method that could have been used. And my position, again, after a lifetime in law enforcement, is pretty dang simple. We need to see the evidence before we decide. We need the body cam. We need a clearer picture of Duarte's behavior that day. We need to understand the deputy's perception in that very moment. We need to know if anybody recognized warning signs earlier in the day or, frankly, earlier in his life. And did anyone try to intervene? But the only thing that we can say right now, with absolute certainty at this point, is that a crisis met a gun. And it ended in a way that will haunt everybody that's involved. I guarantee that. Because when the footage is released, you can bet that we're going to go through it all together. We're going to talk about it, and it's going to tell us about the training and human perception under stress and how we can better handle mental health calls in the future. But I want to tell you one thing. It doesn't tell you how quickly someone can close the gap in a knife fight. And so what I want to do is just show you a couple of quick training videos to give you a sense. They call it the 21-foot rule. And you'll see why somebody with a knife is just as dangerous to a police officer with a gun than somebody that has a gun tucked away in their pocket. Let's watch.
Elsewhere tonight, there's an old expression that goes, don't bring a knife to a gunfight. But tonight in a special report, I'll show you how that rule may not mean what you think. If I told you that a man with a knife could run up and stab you before you could pull a gun and protect yourself, what do you think the safe distance would be? 5 feet? 10 feet? What if I told you 21 feet? 21 feet is closer than you think. In this demonstration, a police training officer using a rubber knife covers the ground to a second officer every time he tries. Officer Nicely, how did you feel like you had a reasonable opportunity to draw your weapon when he was coming at you within 21 feet?
Within 21 feet, no, I did not.
These blue pads simulate the walls of a house at the Roanoke Police Academy, where, like most training centers around the nation since the 1980s, police teach something called the 21-foot rule. Here, it's measured from a piece of tape on the floor. And how does somebody know what 21 feet is?
That's kind of funny. It's a, you're looking at it. It's just an estimate. There's no tape on the floor out here every day, but you get used to the distances that we communicate with people.
We set it up out in the open with a different assailant. You can see it play out as a recruit from this year's class easily covers the 21 feet before the officer can draw and shoot him. Police say reaction takes longer than action, something they call the reaction gap. We timed the video, and it took just over 1.5 seconds for the guy with the knife to cover the distance. In some cases, the officer draws and gets the shot off, but he also gets stabbed. Remember, the bullet won't stop the man dead in his tracks. Why not just shoot him?
Well, that's not what we're trying to do. And in fact, our deadly force policy is that an officer can only use deadly force if there is an imminent threat of serious injury or death to the officer or to another person.
That's a stricter definition than in some departments and in line with recommendations released less than a month ago by PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum, which wants to close the gap between what is strictly legal for police and what the public expects of them, in part because of public reaction to a number of police shootings in recent years. The new policies say agency use of force should go beyond the legal standard of objective reasonableness, that prosecutors and grand juries often find that a fatal shooting by an officer is not a crime, even though they may not consider the use of force proportional or necessary. Proportional is the key word. Policy 3 explains, in assessing whether a response is proportional, officers must ask themselves, how would the general public view the action we took? Would they think it was appropriate to the entire situation and to the severity of the threat posed to me or the public? Policy 16 even refers to the 21-foot rule as an outdated concept that, quote, agencies should eliminate from their policies and training. Chief Hall attended the conference where the new policies were unveiled and points out that both Roanoke County and Roanoke were already doing much of what was recommended. Often, he says, it's as simple as the officer with the gun slowing things down.
Drop the knife, sir. Nobody needs to get hurt. Just drop it. We'll talk.
So, in our instance, the officer can simply back up, giving himself more than 21 feet. He can put something like a table or a car or a wall between himself and the man. Anything to prevent imminent danger to himself or an innocent bystander.
The idea is that everybody involved in an incident goes home safely. The officer, victims, witnesses, and the subject.
But none of this changes the fact that legally, if there's a man with a knife inside the so-called safety zone of 21 feet, the officer may have only 2 seconds to make a decision. So the takeaway here is that police realize that the public expectation of their actions is evolving and they must evolve with it. But there is also no escaping the fact that officers often must make very important decisions very quickly.
There you go, folks. I hope you'll put your comments down below on this particular one so that we can have a little more conversation about it.
Well, hey folks, the holidays are coming fast, and I've got something really special if you've got true crime lovers on your Christmas list. I'm signing my books through the end of November. Wolves in Sheep's Clothing. It's my newest book, and it's all about understanding predatory behavior. Now, the second book is She Knew No Fear. It's the story of my great-great-grandmother's 1891 murder and how I solved that thing more than a century later. And finally, Deceived, an investigative memoir of the Zion Society cult. It's the story of survival, hope, and justice, and it's chronicles my investigation into an ultimate takedown of a cult that was sexually abusing children. So if you live in the United States, just know you can get signed copies with free shipping through profilingevil.com. If you live anywhere else in the world, buy the book through Amazon. Happy holidays.
But now I want to switch gears from Texas to right here in Nevada, here in Las Vegas. This is one case that's been on everybody's lips at this conference. This road rage murder of an 11-year-old boy who was just sitting in the back seat of his stepfather's SUV trying to go to school. So let me try to paint a picture of this one for you. It's morning and it's early. The sun's up. The kids are half awake. They're sitting in the back seats. Backpacks are on the floorboards. Maybe they're finishing their breakfast or talking about school. On the 215 Beltway just over here, traffic is already heavy. And two drivers, one in an SUV and another in a sedan, start doing that little dance that we've all seen and unfortunately many of us have done. They're cutting in and out of traffic. They're not letting the other guy in front of them. They're speeding up, slowing down, posturing, showing each other who's boss over a few feet of blacktop or concrete. Now this kind of thing usually ends with a dirty look, maybe a horn blast, and then everybody goes on with their day. But not this time. According to police, as the tensions were escalating, the driver of the sedan, a man named Tyler Matthew Johns, pulled out a handgun and fired a shot into that SUV. The bullet struck the 11-year-old boy in the back seat. While the child was rushed to the hospital, he still died there. It was just a kid on his way to school, executed in the middle of a traffic spat that he had nothing to do with. Now, there are two people involved in this thing, the stepdad and the shooter. The kid was just an innocent bystander. And you can feel why this community is so angry. Local commentary hasn't focused on clever headlines or salacious angles. It's focused on the raw human question of how did we get to this point where a lane change can turn into a death sentence for a child.
On 215 westbound near Gibson, two vehicles became involved in a road rage incident when they began jockeying for positions, trying to pass each other on the congested freeway. One vehicle tried to pass the other vehicle on the shoulder, and at that time, both occupants of their vehicles rolled the window down and got into a verbal exchange. Our suspect then produced a handgun and fired one round at our victim vehicle, tragically striking an 11-year-old passenger who was sitting in the back seat of that vehicle. The stepfather driving the victim vehicle then rammed the suspect vehicle, causing them both to come to a stop in the middle of the freeway. Both drivers then got out of their vehicle and got in a heated exchange. At this time, a Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department officer was driving by on the freeway, was held down, and was able to take the suspect into custody. Shortly after that, the Henderson Fire Department arrived on scene, and despite their best efforts and the efforts of the medical professionals at UMC, that 11-year-old succumbed to his injuries. Henderson Police Homicide Section responded, and they have arrested the 22-year-old suspect for open murder. I just want to remind everybody that we lost a life today that we didn't have to lose. An 11-year-old was on his way to school, and this senseless act took his life. I need everybody to be patient on our roadways. We have an obligation to look out for each other. The holidays are coming up, and we usually have congestion and tempers run high. It is not worth it to engage in this type of behavior on either party. I would rather you be stuck in traffic and late for your destination than have to go to a funeral for a loved one or potentially spend the rest of your life in prison. So we have to do better As a city, we have to do better as a community. We have to do better as human beings because we can't allow this to continue to happen.
The car that these guys are driving, this little bubble of anonymity becomes a weapon. People feel emboldened to act in ways that they would never consider if they were standing face to face in line at the grocery store. The psychology is pretty consistent in these road rage cases. You got stress involved. I mean, everybody's running late on the road, right? You got kids in the car. You got egos involved. This mentality of, hey, this is my lane and you're not cutting in front of me. You got this false feeling of being insulated, like the vehicle is somehow shielding your conscience. Then you mix in some weapons accessibility, maybe a lifetime of poor impulse control, and suddenly this thing becomes combustible. Now, I don't believe that either driver woke up that morning intending to participate in a murder. But they let irritation dominate their behavior. They let pride take control of the wheel of the car they were driving. And when Johns decided to introduce a firearm into the environment, he made a choice that can never be undone. In that split second, he transformed a traffic dispute into a murder scene, and he turned a school commute into a nightmare. This is exactly the kind of case where we as everyday drivers have to ask ourselves, what am I capable of doing? What am I capable of preventing? The victim's family, they didn't choose this. Now, the father, the stepfather, he has some culpability. That little boy didn't choose this. But we all have daily opportunity to either de-escalate our own behavior and refuse other invitations to have a conflict, or escalate. And when a stranger tailgates you, when he cuts you off, flips you off, you can join the fight or you can exit the script. You can stare him down, you can brake check him, you can shout back, or you can just look straight ahead, change lanes, get off at the next exit, and call 911 if things escalate. You know, the safest move is always to change the geography, not change the other driver. Create some distance between you. Get to a well-lit, populated area and don't lead an aggressive driver to your home. Don't pull over in dark corners or parking lots to talk it out. That's how these situations go from bad to catastrophic. And if you've got your kids in the car, use these moments as teaching tools. Model some calm behavior. Tell them, hey kids, we're not going to engage with this driver. We're going to let him go. You know, our children watch us closely. And if we give in to rage, they'll learn to do the same thing. This little boy in Henderson, Nevada, just outside of Las Vegas, should be alive today. He should be thinking about video games or Thanksgiving break coming up, not being remembered at a funeral. And the really sad part of all of this is it all hinged on simple choices that could have gone one way or the other. And that's the theme that connects our final case together with this one. Simple choices can have devastating consequences. So our last story, this one is crazy because it stretches over 15 years. So I want to take you from the heat and speed of Las Vegas traffic into the slow kind of horror that's been kind of unfolding in Michigan since 2010. The case is the case of the Skelton Brothers, and it's one of the most haunting law enforcement cases and frankly true crime cases in a long time. 3 boys, Andrew, 9 years old, Alexander, 7, Tanner, 5. They went to spend Thanksgiving with their father. Parents were separated, divorced. John Skelton had them come over November of 2010, and then the kids were never seen again. Now their mother, Tanya, had every reason to expect a normal custody visit. It was part of the routine, whether they liked it or not. They were going to have Thanksgiving with Dad, and then they were going to go back home. But the day after Thanksgiving, Skelton, Dad, attempts suicide. And while in the hospital, he tells Tanya and the investigators that the boys are safe, but he refused to say what he'd done with them. He claimed that he'd given them to a woman named Joanne Taylor, who was supposedly part of a group that was protecting them from Tanya. Some people say it was all about the Amish, but it didn't take long for investigators to determine that Joanne Taylor didn't exist. And within hours, the investigation kicked into high gear. Remember, this is 2010, 15 years ago. Every resource was deployed by local law enforcement. They brought in Michigan State Police, other Ohio authorities. They brought in the federal agencies. They brought in tracking dogs, air support, volunteers, and for days and days, they searched fields, woods, drainage ditches, and abandoned buildings across 2 different states. Not a single piece of physical evidence tied to the boys was ever recovered. No clothing, no bodies, no personal items, nothing. And Dad remained quiet. Kind of reminds you of what's going on with Melody Buzzard. And while those searches were underway, Skelton got transferred to a hospital in Ohio, and there he was arrested for parental kidnapping. Now, he started fighting extradition back to Michigan using all kinds of legal maneuvering, and he was using silence as his primary tool of control. But eventually, he waived extradition. He was returned to Michigan, arraigned, and bound over for trial. And during this period of time, he changed his story yet again. Now saying that he'd given the children to Joanne Taylor, but not to Joanne, an unnamed organization, an underground group. And he refused to identify the group. And that was something that really got to people. Now, seasoned investigators recognized what was going on. The narrative was shifting left and right. There were also new facts that were emerging. And most importantly, they sensed that Skelton was improvising. Each time one lie fell apart, Skelton would build a new one. You know, there are experts of deception like Dr. Paul Ekman who call this leakage, this natural breakdown of a false story over time. And the inconsistencies themselves become evidence of dishonesty. Well, by early 2011, so, we're talking 3-4 months, investigators were no longer dealing with a missing persons case in their minds. They believed they were dealing with a probable homicide. Skelton's absolute refusal to reveal the boy's location, combined with those contradictory statements that he was making, pushed prosecutors to upgrade his charges from parental kidnapping to unlawful imprisonment. He ultimately pled no contest and was sentenced 10 to 15 years in prison. And this is where it gets crazy. It was a way for government to hold him accountable even without the bodies. But without direct confession, it was tough. But what it wasn't justice for the 3 little missing Skelton boys. And over the years that followed, the case continued to simmer. Then in 2013, it was featured on John Walsh's program, and that generated a few fresh tips, but no breakthroughs. Now later that year, Michigan State Police took official control of the investigation, and they began looking at it. They didn't do it because the cops had dropped the ball. They did it because of the scale and the complexity of the case demanded broader reach, more capability. In 2017, there was a little more hope flickering, but then it quickly faded when the remains of the boys were thought to be found in Montana. For a moment, investigators and the public held their breath, wondering if it was finally the answer. Forensic testing revealed that those remains were not the Skelton brothers, and the mystery deepened again. And then 5 years ago in 2020, HLN aired a documentary where they re-examined the case. They had age progression images from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They released images showing what Alexander, Andrew, and Tanner might look like as teenagers. Well, by 2023, Tanya had to make a decision that no parent should ever have to consider. She petitioned the court to have her sons legally declared deceased. It wasn't surrender. It was just an acknowledgement that the legal system needed to align with the reality of her heart. something that she had known for years, that her boys were dead. When that petition was granted in March of 2025, the Skelton brothers, in the eyes of the law, were now deceased, though the courts never stopped short of declaring their death homicides. Meanwhile, the investigators kept working. They continued to gather every scrap of evidence that they could find, every strange artifact from Skelton's home, every digital trace, as Skelton sat in prison. They found a noose in his residence early on. They found a Bible with a specific passage that was circled that really bothered him. They had a letter that he'd written to Tanya that read like a twisted spiritual confession. They had the FBI doing workups on internet searches related to methods of killing and disposing bodies. Then came November 2025. Skelton was nearing the end of his sentence. He'd actually had a date set for his release. And then just 16 days before he was scheduled to walk out of prison, Michigan State Police and prosecutors stepped up to the podium and announced that John Skelton had been formally charged with 3 counts of open murder and 3 counts of evidence tampering. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It was the culmination of 15 years of investigative work and a strategic choice about timing. This guy wasn't getting out of prison. He was now facing murder charges. You know, it's tough because in these nobody cases, there's a risk of acquittal that's really high. But prosecutors will oftentimes wait till the last possible moment, thinking that they might now have the strongest possible circumstantial case. And I think before filing the charges, they felt they could finally put a label on what everybody else was quietly believing all along. You see, from a behavioral standpoint, the Skelton case is chilling, but it's not unique. It's about a father that loses control in a custody conflict. He begins seeing his children not as independent people, but as extensions of himself. And then he makes this catastrophic choice to remove them from the other parent permanently. In this case, it appears that he wraps the act in religious language and fantasy, saying things like, I did this to protect them. They're safe with others. Their mother is dangerous. Well, in order to preserve a sense of moral authority in his own mind, it appears this guy used silence as leverage. He drug out the agony for years because he felt like information was the only thing of power that he had left. But when you step back and look at all 3 of these cases, the Michael Duarte case in Texas, the 11-year-old boy on the 215 in Nevada, or the Skelton brothers in Michigan, they all might seem different. You see, one involves law enforcement and a man in crisis. Another involves road rage and a child in the crossfire. And the third involves a father who allegedly turns on his own children and turns them into pawns in a custody war. But underneath, all of these cases are kind of the same fundamentally. It's about behavior under stress that matters. These decisions people make in moments of fear or anger or desperation can echo for lifetimes. The Duarte case asks us to wrestle with how we respond to mental health crises and what tools we give police officers or communities to handle them. This little boy in Las Vegas, this case begs us to examine how we manage our own tempers and egos, especially when we're behind the wheel. And the Skelton case forces us to confront how dangerous custody conflicts can become even more tragic when somebody's need for control outweighs their capacity for love. So as you log off tonight, as you go about your life, I hope you'll think about these stories in more than just a true crime fan way. Pay attention to your own reactions in stressful moments. Pay attention to the people in your life who might be silently slipping toward crises. And pay attention to the kids riding in your back seat, the kids that are watching how you handle conflict out on the road. And pay attention to how the courts, the cops, neighbors, family members, everyone responds when a parent starts using children as weapons in a custody dispute. You know, the more we understand about behavior, the more opportunities that we have to interrupt the slide toward tragedy. And that, to me, is what true crime should ultimately be about. Not something to just entertain us, but something that teaches us how to recognize danger, how to understand motives, and maybe, just maybe, how to avoid becoming part of the next criminal case that we're talking about on Profiling Evil. So thanks for sticking with me through these 3 tough stories. And if you found this conversation helpful, please hit the like and subscribe button and share Profiling Evil with your friends. Please consider how you could apply some of these lessons in your own life. So until we meet next time, stay safe, stay curious. And from Las Vegas, Nevada, remember, evil leaves clues. Together, we're going to keep learning how to spot those clues. Thanks for your support of Profiling Evil. Look for us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, and TikTok. And if you like audio podcasts, make sure you're checking out Profiling Evil's audio podcasts on your favorite podcast platform. And make sure you're subscribing to our new podcast that's coming out on February 3rd with Gamut Podcast Network. It's called Gardens of Evil, and it is going to be exceptional. It'll be season 5 of American Nightmare on Gamut. Hey, thanks for your support of Profiling Evil. We'll see you soon at the next crime scene.